Um, my name is Joe Lombardo. I am the coordinator of UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition, who is sponsoring who was one of the sponsors of the webinar today. And the other sponsor is, I believe it's the Emergency Committee. Let me get the exact name if I can. It's the San Francisco Bay Area No to U.S. NATO War in Ukraine Emergency Coalition. And this is really sponsored by UNAC out on the West Coast, but available to everybody. The situation in Ukraine is very confusing for a lot of people in the anti-war movement. And so we titled this the Ukraine War, a Challenge for the U.S. Anti-War Movement. Those of us who are anti-imperialists and anti-war activists as well have always focused all of our attention on the United States for many, many good reasons. First of all, we are in the United States. As Che Guevara so aptly put it, we are in the belly of the beast. The United States is clearly the main imperialist power in the world. It has about 172 countries, and it has about 20 times the number of foreign military bases as all other countries combined. The country with the second most military bases is the US ally, NATO ally, Britain, and the country with the third most foreign military bases is the US NATO ally, France. These are left over from the remnants of their colonial past. They still have neo-colonial powers, but this was from a time before. In addition, the United States has been involved in one war after another, and one sanction after another, and one coup after another. It has been the main imperialist force in the world. Now, the cause of the conflict is something that we need to look at. The cause of the conflict in Ukraine. I'm sure a number of you have heard before that in 1991, the US made a promise to the Soviet Union as it was dissolving, that it would not move NATO east, closer to the borders of Russia. It would not move it east of Germany. However, today it is in 14 of those countries. It has nuclear-capable missiles right on the Russian border. It has held war games right on the Russian border. And at the same time it has nuclear-capable missiles, it unilaterally has withdrawn from the intermediate nuclear missile treaty. So it creates a great danger for Russia. But Ukraine is a bigger danger. It has a gigantic border with Russia. It has the largest border of any European country. If missiles were placed on the border, Russian border with Ukraine, they could be 4 minutes from Moscow. There's no way Moscow or Russia could defend against that. And they do not want to live with that. So they made a red line that no NATO in Ukraine. This war could have been stopped had the United States just agreed to that, but they would not agree to that red line. The United States is very good at setting red lines. We set them all the time. But for Russia to set a red line that it feels it's needed for its own security, they were unwilling to go along with that. The United States recognizes no legitimate security needs of Russia. And until that happens, there will always be conflict. Now, there's a war going on, but we don't see the war in the American media. We see people leaving the country, going to Poland, going to other places. We don't see them leaving the country, going to Russia from the east of Ukraine, but hundreds of thousands have. We don't see the war around Donbass, but that's where the war is taking place. You see Russian convoys stalled, and they say, well, maybe they ran out of gas, maybe this, maybe that. But Russia entered that country on the ground. It didn't do it the way the US does it, with its shock and awe, for instance, when it went into Iraq, where it massively bombed Baghdad. During the Vietnam War, it carpet bombed Hanoi, destroyed just about every building, killed thousands and thousands. 4 million were killed in Vietnam. Maybe 1.5 million were killed in Iraq. You haven't seen those kind of numbers. Russia has said, we are trying not to kill civilians, we are trying to be careful, and that's what you can see. But in the Donbass, where Ukraine put most of its army and most of its shock troops, the real Nazis, the Azov Brigade, people like that, they have been shelling for 8 years. This war has been going on for 8 years. And in the last week, it was so intensified that the leaders of the independent regions in Lugansk and Donetsk in Donbass asked the Russians to come in. And that is when they came in. I spoke to people in Donbass today. They say, whatever you're hearing in your news media there, you don't hear our voices. And let me tell you what our voices are. The Russian military coming into Donbass is a liberation army. That's what they said. That's what was said to me today. We've also sent stuff out to some people. You might have seen it on UNAC lists and other places of comments from friends of ours in Odessa and other places. It's a narrative you don't hear. The US says that Russia has closed down press sites, but you know, they didn't do that until the US has closed down their press sites. We're not told that we are blocking them. We're just told the other way around. We hear a narrative, one side, and I believe almost nothing that I hear on the US media today. So we need to get the other side out. We need to be strong and continue to look at the United States as the main aggressor, main imperialist power in the world, and its allies in NATO. We must say no to NATO, no expansion of NATO, and stop this war. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to our next speaker, who is, hang on, sorry about this, I got it in a million places. Our next speaker is Patricia Gorky, and she's the West Coast organizer for the Answer Coalition. Patricia, you're on.
Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone who is here tonight, joining on this webinar. For real information, that, as Joe was saying, we are not going to receive on the mass media of the corporate-owned media right now, which functions as an echo chamber of the government, is pouring out a hysteria and pumping up this pressure for war. In his first State of the Union address this past Tuesday, President Biden, he cast the war in Ukraine as a struggle to defend democracy. And he said, in the battle between democracy and autocracy, democracies are rising to the moment. And then he claimed this while praising the freedom-loving nations that are confronting Russia. And for the first 15 minutes, there was this bipartisan ovation after ovation, which, you know, really shows where bipartisan really becomes a thing for war. It's not there for healthcare. It's not there for education. It's not there for housing, but bipartisanship for war, that's where they unite. But democracy has nothing to do with US foreign policy. In 2019, the US backed a coup, a military coup against the democratically elected government of Bolivia, Evo Morales, much in the same way that in 2009, they backed the military coup in Honduras and the US and allies. And then in 2011, when the US and NATO destroyed Libya, the country with the highest standard of living in Africa. And the pretext, by the way, for this, the way that it was explained to the people here in the US, was that the Libyan soldiers had been given Viagra and they were heading for Benghazi in the east, where there was this rebellion going on and they were going to carry out mass rape. That was the story. That was a story that was broadcast by the corporate-owned media to the American people. And then that story completely disappeared once it had served its purpose. And today, slavery's been introduced into Libya, and thousands of people have died in the Mediterranean trying to get out of what is a nightmarish state. And those refugees who are fleeing this war that was caused by the U.S. and NATO are the ones who are being turned around or who are being allowed to drown in these boats on European shores. And we're seeing the hypocrisy and the racism, the deep racism in these pundits who, when they're determining which refugees they will support and which refugees they won't. The U.S. government wants to dominate all of Europe, and they view Russia as an obstacle to that domination. They want to be the unchallenged rulers of the world. And even, after the fall of the Soviet Union, it only took a matter of weeks for the first documents of the U.S. to actually come out and say that their strategy is one for global domination, and there should be one dominant power. And during the last national security strategy, the U.S. has openly declared that major power confrontation with Russia and China is on the agenda. So it's critical to understand and that we don't support this invasion. We're not asked to, and it's not our decision. But we reserve our strongest condemnation for the U.S. government, which rejected Russia's legitimate security concerns in the region and has completely refused to make any acknowledgements for that. This war is the consequence of decades of humiliation and bullying by the U.S. against Russia. The U.S. could end this war today. They could end this war immediately with a diplomatic solution that disbands NATO. Stops this military encroachment of Russia. There is no military solution to this war. Sanctions are war, no war on Russia.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Jacqueline Luqman. She's the co-host of By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik. She's the Mid-Atlantic organizer of Black Alliance for Peace, which is a UNAC affiliated organization. Jacqueline, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. And it just so happens that earlier today, I received some more tragic news. The son of my late husband, who died just in June of last year, has now passed away. And this is important in this conversation, believe it or not, because both my husband and his son died from preventable conditions, preventable disorders, that if we did not live in a capitalist system that prioritized people's health, their mental health, their physical health, and did not make profit out of providing access to healthcare, they would both still be alive. What do I mean? We have been told that the Build Back Better legislation, which was $6 trillion, I think originally, $4 or $6 trillion originally, was too much money, couldn't afford it. That's money that would have been spent over 10 years if it was the full amount, $4 or $6 trillion. And that comes out to about, if it was $4 trillion, the original amount, it comes out to about 400 billion a year. If it was $6 trillion, it comes out to about 600 billion a year over 10 years. The infrastructure bill, the same thing, either $4 or $6 trillion, just 6 or 400 billion dollars a year over 10 years. But that was too much money to allocate for the Democrats and the Republicans to allocate for people and our needs, healthcare and substance abuse treatment and mental health treatment. That was too much money to build roads and hospitals and clinics that people need. But the House just passed a $350 billion Competes Act to challenge China. The House has unilaterally given $200 million in weapons to Ukraine since December. And that's on top of the $400 million the US has already given Ukraine since 2021. That's in addition to the $780 billion defense bill. And I don't know how much money has been sent to Ukraine since 2014, since the coup. But I do know that the late Representative John Conyers tried to stop Congress from funding the neo-Nazi units that were being incorporated into Ukraine, And he even tweeted that the House passed his amendment to the 2016 spending bill to deny funding to the Azov Battalion and the neo-Nazi units in Ukraine. But that amendment, which was passed by the House and the Senate, was mysteriously stripped from the final spending bill. So ever since 2014, Congress has been sending money, untold, unaccounted for amounts of money to neo-Nazis in Ukraine, while our family members can't get health care because it's too expensive, can't get medical care, treatment for bipolar disorder, which my husband suffered from, treatment for substance abuse disorder, which my husband suffered from, treatment for just to be able to afford health insurance that his son could not afford. He worked a full-time job. He made money for a real estate agent that did not provide him health care, and he could not afford the premiums under the ACA. He had hypertension and he had a stroke and he died. But this government can spend over $1 trillion since December to arm neo-Nazis in Ukraine that have been waging a civil war against the people of Donbass and the Crimean region. So I had to come here tonight with my heart broken again, because this is not just an esoteric conversation about stopping war. It is literally about saving people's lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. You really have everybody's sympathies and condolences. I met your husband, and when I met him, it was in 2019 in Washington, D.C., when we were all there for a demonstration against NATO. It's very appropriate today. All I can say is human needs above profits. That's our call for all of us. Next, we're going to hear from Elizabeth Murray, who's from Friends of Crimea. She was a CIA analyst and served as the Deputy National Intelligence Office in the National Intelligence Council. Since leaving the intelligence service, she has become an anti-war and anti-nuclear activist. She went to Crimea and created this video. The video was done by Regis Tremblay. People might know him. He's done a number of videos, and he himself is now living in Crimea and has made many trips to Donbass and has been recording people in Crimea and Donbass with a very different narrative, again, that you're hearing in the US media. He also went on a trip that UNAC co-sponsored, sponsored to Odessa, where at the time, we've done a couple of trips to Odessa to support the families of those people who were killed by the Nazis after the 2014 coup, when they were protesting the coup. As many parts of Ukraine, there were protests. The Nazis had mobilized to come to a football game, and at a given signal, they all marched to the House of Trade Unions, where the protesters were holding a 24/7 protest occupation, similar to what Occupy Wall Street was in some ways, and they attacked them. with guns and pipes and Molotov cocktails. Many ran into the building. They set the building on fire, and 48 of them were killed. However, none of them were arrested, even though I can see clearly the faces of all these people shooting guns and throwing Molotov cocktails on the many, many cell phone videos that there was. But they did arrest several of the people who survived this attack. And the next day, 30,000 Odessans showed up at the police station and released them. That's people power. These are another voice of Ukrainians that you're not hearing on me. So now we're going to play the short video from her after her visit to Crimea. Judy, you're going to do this, I believe.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Murray. I'm a member of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity and the Sam Adams Associates for Integrity in Intelligence. I'm retired from a 27-year career as a political analyst with the US government. I was fortunate enough to visit Crimea in June of 2016 with Sharon Tennyson's Center for Citizen Initiatives, among other cities in the Russian Republic. My impression of Crimea is that it's a jewel. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world that I have ever seen. And we were fortunate there to meet with journalists and teachers and actually veterans of World War II, and even representatives of the community of Crimean Tatars that are now returning to the Crimea. I was sad to see in Crimea that the sanctions had really affected the country. The cruise ships that normally filled the harbors of Crimea in the summertime were absent. I was really naive about what the effect of the sanctions were on the people. So it was important for me to be there and see for myself. In fact, I tried to use my Visa card in the hotel and received a small expression of surprise that I wasn't aware that, you know, my own country's sanctions were forbidding the use of Visa cards. And also, of course, in our conversations with many professionals in Crimea, we found that many people-to-people exchanges with the United States for language, for culture, for music, the arts, and science had been shut down. So really, I came away with the impression that US sanctions on Russia were actually against the cause of peace and were doing perhaps irreparable damage to relations between our countries. I also want to share my impression of the referendum that took place on returning Crimea to the Russian territory. And that was something that clearly the Russian people wanted, the people of Crimea wanted. I understand that well over 90% of the people in Russia voted that they wanted to be part of Russia and not part of the Ukraine. So it seems to me that since Khrushchev arbitrarily gave Crimea to the Ukraine in 1957, it seems quite logical, and everything seemed peaceful in Crimea. So it seems like, in contrast to what happened with the Maidan coup, where there was so much violence and so many deaths, my understanding is that not even a shot was fired when this decision to return Crimea to Russia took place. So clearly this was not a dictator grabbing a country or grabbing territory as it's portrayed in our country's media, but it was something that the people wanted. So, one of the reasons that I joined the Friends of Crimea was because we have a problem in the United States with information. There's literally a blackout on the Russian side of things. And I think it was really wonderful to have an opportunity to travel to Russia and meet people who wanted to be friends with Americans and who asked me many times, you know, why can't our people have peaceful relations? And a special treat of my time in Crimea was the chance to meet with the World War II veterans and the heroes of the war. And I think our visit there actually coincided with a Veterans Day ceremony, which we also attended. But the veterans themselves talked about how they remember being allied with Americans in beating back Nazism, and how they would love to have such a similar relationship with the United States again. And I think I was so enthused by their sincere feelings and just by the genuine openness and friendliness of everyone I met there, that I just suggested at the meeting, why don't we have a swim for peace tomorrow? Why don't we all go to the Black Sea and swim? And I didn't know how these people were going to respond. But sure enough, the next day, I think it was at 10 o'clock in the morning, at the appointed time, these World War II Soviet veterans showed up in their swimming trunks, and we all went into the water and swam out and talked to each other regardless of whether we understood each other or not. And that morning, the Black Sea in Crimea was filled with the ocean of goodwill. And I'm not exaggerating, it was really a fun time. And when we came back to shore, the mayor of Yalta, which is the city where we were swimming at, and it's an absolutely gorgeous tourist town, had laid out this wonderful reception for us with all the delicious fresh fruits and wines that are native to Crimea. And I really hoped at that time that, you know, we could have an annual swim for peace between Americans and the people of Crimea. And maybe someday we can revive that annual tradition. But I'm really honored to have the opportunity to become a member of the Friends of Crimea. And I hope to return at the earliest opportunity. So thank you, Regis, for this chance to share my experience in Crimea.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that was a moving presentation, and it also gives another narrative that you don't normally hear in the United States. People, if they have questions of the panelists, please put them in the question and answer area at the bottom of your screen. There's a little icon there to do that. And that's the way we can get questions, because we're not going to be able to answer questions or get questions through the chat. Things will roll off very quickly. So if you have questions, please put them there, and we'll do a question and answer period after everybody speaks. So we're going to next hear from Rick Sterling. Rick is active in several organizations, including the Task Force on the Americas, Syria Solidarity Movement, and Veterans for Peace. He also does research and writing on international issues. I also work with Rick in the Sanctions Kill Coalition, where he was one of the lead authors of an incredible paper that we put out, which we've distributed to many Congress people and also to people in the United Nations and others about the situation with sanctions around the world, which are now hitting 41 countries, I believe it is. So Rick, you're up.
Thanks very much, Joe. It's great to be here. And just by the way, I was with Elizabeth on that delegation to Crimea. I can confirm everything she said. It was a fantastic Ray McGovern and Kathy Kelly and Wright and various other people were there. We talked with a lot of different Crimeans. They universally said when the coup happened in Kiev, that was the last straw. And they wanted to break with Ukraine, which they had been administratively put a part of when in the Soviet Union, and they wanted to reunify with Russia, which Crimea has been a part of since 1783. So I just want to make a couple of points since we don't have much time. One is that my heart really goes out to Jacqueline and what she said about the cost of militarism, the fact that we're spending all these billions and billions of dollars on the war machine. And I want to bring up one other element to this, which is, in a way, it's an opportunity, because what we are seeing very quickly is that the cost of sanctions, these sanctions on Russia, are not just hurting Russians, they're hurting people in the US. I filled up my gas tank the other day and I was shocked how much it costs. It's $5.50 a gallon here in the Bay Area. And this is a direct result of the conflict and the war that the U.S. is engaged in with Russia, the economic war, the information war, the hatred and Russophobia, which is really, I mean, to me, it's really disgusting. But in addition to the fact that this money is being wasted there, all the lives that are destroyed and the theft of resources that should be going into healthcare and education, we have the additional factor now that it's rising our own cost of living on a daily basis. And I think this is one way we can reach a broad audience, because everybody's going to be seeing this now. There's another element to the situation that I want to bring up, which is fake news. There's pervasive propaganda now. I urge people to not believe everything you see on TV. Just the other day, I saw an interesting video which showed a person walking in front of a big building, and the building was perfectly fine. He was fine. Then they showed the video showed the building burning, and then they showed the building destroyed. So it was all artificially done through graphic techniques. I have no doubt that just as hundreds of millions of dollars were spent on fake videos in the Iraq War, it was revealed later on, that may be going on right now. Fake news.
1 minute.
Zelensky is being airbrushed, and he's being put forward as this great leader, this great populist with all this massive support in Ukraine. It's not true. I looked up statistics from the Center for the Center for Economic and Political Studies in Ukraine. Here are the results. He was inaugurated in 2019. In February 20, he had the trust of 52% of the population. In March 21 last year, he had 31% trust, and by November of 2021, that is just a few months ago, the trust had fallen further to 28%. This is a guy who is very unpopular in Ukraine.
4 minutes.
So I think we can just imagine, since it's his alliance with the United States and his really giving in to the Azov Battalion and the other neo-Nazi militias, that has precipitated this, that has made it impossible to follow the Minsk agreement and resolve the conflict in the East. So this is just another element of the fake news, the false information, the propaganda war that we're experiencing right now. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Rick. Our next speaker, and please remember to put questions in the question and answer period place on the bottom of your screen. Our next speaker is Ronda Romero. She's been active in the movement for national democracy in the Philippines since the 1990s. Rhonda is the chair of BAYAN USA, which is a multi-sectional alliance of over 30 Filipino organizations fighting for national and social liberation in the Philippines. Rhonda is also a member of the International Coordinating Committee of the International League for People's Struggle. She is on the administrative committee of UNAC, United National Antiwar Coalition, and she is the secretary of Resist US-led War Movement. Rhonda, you're up.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for having me here. It's really good to join so many people who are very clear on the root causes of this conflict and trying to dispel the fake news and the misinformation that's out there. For BAYAN USA, we agree that the most important reason behind the crisis in Ukraine right now is primarily and principally because of the US and its NATO allies trying to cement their political and military control over the Ukrainian government and over the resources of Ukraine. One thing that may be a little bit different from my comrades on this call is that we also, recognize that, Russia has a responsibility here too. But principally, we have to be clear that it's the US and NATO that are primarily responsible for what has happened. And it's when you look into the roots, it becomes very clear that there's, a real stake. What's at stake here is the geopolitical and economic interests of different global powers in the region, and who's at the losing end. It's exactly, the people that, Jackie was talking about earlier. It's the people, it's the working masses, the workers and people of Ukraine, Eastern Europe, all over the world, including here in the United States. The people who are not going to be getting the resources spent on healthcare, education, and so forth, but instead, the resources are being invested in war and militarism. Now, the conflict in Ukraine, we really see as involving many different economic, social, and political factors. So within Ukraine itself, the eastern region is a former industrial center for coal mining and ironworks. It was home to actually many working class communities, while the western end was historically seen as Europe's breadbasket, and self-sufficient farming communities. But from European feudal empires, competition for colonies from the late 19th century, and then the competition for the territory up to today, these regions have come under the influence of foreign powers, culminating in the loss of industrialization in the East and monopoly corporate control over agriculture in the West. And so, leading up to the US-backed coup in 2014, you did have people, protesting in unrest over the problems that were being caused by this. So, we view this, the BAYAN USA really views this as an internal matter that the people of Ukraine should be able and allowed to solve on their own as a sovereign people without the US and NATO being involved in trying to, prop up this new coup government. And then—
1 minute.
Thank you. It's also been very clear what their interests are. So more weapons to the area, take over, influence Ukraine so that it can be right there on the border of Russia. We saw that in the whole buildup with the troops and arms being sent to the area. It's still continuing today. For BAYAN, what we see is we have to view our struggle as linked and not, just Filipinos for the Philippines, but really we're internationalists. And so we see that as internationalists, we have to link our struggle to the struggle of Ukrainian workers who are fighting for the right to livelihood there, the struggle for the Ukrainian people who are trying to fight back against the fascists in their own government, and for the people of the Donbas region who want to assert their independence and have their independence recognized. We also relate to the millions of people who are being driven from the area, forced out of the area to be migrants by war, but not just the war that's happening now, but the war that has been happening, as others have said on this call, for the past 8 years because of Ukraine's repression, intense fascist repression being meted out on the people in the Donbass region. So we relate to that as a people who are also under attack by our own fascist government, US-backed government of Duterte, which has been, and the US military intervention that we've been experiencing over 120 years. And so we, say that we all must stand up and oppose US imperialism, oppose the expansion of NATO and into Ukraine and the whole area, and stand in solidarity with people who are fighting against this kind of imperialist aggression.
Thank you, Rhonda. I also just want to make the point that you probably hear Pippa Bartolotti coming in periodically. She's not being rude. She's our timekeeper, and we've all agreed to try to stick to the time. It's one of the hardest jobs because you have to interrupt these very good people that we have on the panel. So our next speaker is going to be Judy Greenspan. And Judy is a longtime activist with the International Action Center. Judy uses the pronouns they and them. They are a public school teacher in Oakland and a union rep with the Oakland Education Association. Judy is also a member of the Bay Area Workers' World Party. Judy, you're up.
Thank you. And it's really great to see a lot of people today. My heartfelt condolences to Jackie for what she's going through. And I will say that batting almost last makes it really hard to talk about what's going on because everyone has done a very good job in terms of talking about, what it has been the role of the US. And we've made it very clear that people on this panel are not for war. I think, though, what hasn't been addressed is how are we going to explain this crisis to the people of this country, not only to the people of this country, but to the rest of the movement? Because what we have found in the Bay Area, we had a series of events, many of which were very small, some of which were very small, because the Bay Area movement has been not fast to respond to what's going on. And that, in fact, as things became more complicated, people backed out and backed out of the coalition that we were building. So we really have to figure out, we have to have clarity around who is causing the war and what we can do to stop it. I think we've all pretty much said that the war would end today if the US would stop pumping billions of dollars of lethal arms and advisors into Ukraine and stop actively shelling the border. And Joe talked about that, and that was fantastic. But here in the US, we are being carpet bombed by the media. We have to unite around concrete demands. And I'm talking specifically, I'm not really addressing Rhonda. Rhonda's is really representing the struggle that's going on in the Philippines and the struggle of Filipino people in this country. But for the US anti-war movement, we have to have a concrete demand. We have to say, disband NATO. Some people have even said, let's just say abolish NATO. That's fine too, because it's NATO that's encircling Russia with military bases. And we know that for the past 8 years, since 2014, the US has organized the fascist coup and has been feasting on it. And we also know that there's no mention in the media that it was NATO weapons, US NATO weapons, responsible for 14,000 civilian deaths. And there has been an ongoing war in the People's Republics of the Donbass and the Lugansk regions, which recently were recognized by Russia as independent republics. And of course, there's no mention of the 20 years of expanding US military bases that have been encircling Russia from Poland and Hungary and Romania and other places. So there are, even from the anti-war movement, and I'm not talking about the panel, I'm really pleased the panel is not calling for this, but there have been within the anti-war movement, certainly within the corporate press, endless calls for Russian troops out of the Ukraine. We would say, how about US troops, advisors, US weapons out of the Ukraine? Because we believe that we have to seriously think about what our slogans should be. If we say Russian troops out, and I think it was Patricia who used the term echo chamber, we become an echo chamber for the US war machine, rubber stamping the unanimous voice of the US politicians. So we got the Democrats and the Republicans, and people have talked about that. They are all, and their corporate media, they are all fighting for the war. Ukraine is not a NATO member, but it has become a de facto NATO member, and it is being manipulated and sacrificed by the US and NATO. And really, I think very important for us not only to be clear about what our position is, that it's US, NATO out, hands off, no sanctions, and of course, sanctions of war, but we have to tie the war to the struggles that people in this country are going through right now. I mean, besides COVID, there's the struggle of homelessness, there's the struggle of the school closures. I spent all day yesterday marching against racist school closures in Oakland, and there's no money. They say there's no money to keep these neighborhood schools open, but we know there's money when it comes to war, US-NATO war against Russia or against the Ukraine. We will not support US-NATO's war, which is really gearing up towards trying to penetrate and trying to dominate Russia, something that they've been trying to do even before it was Russia, when it was the USSR. So I think that we have to be very strong with our message, and we have to demand, we have to not fall in with the chorus of talking about a Russian invasion or Russian troops. We have to say, US, NATO out, you caused the problem. You are responsible for the genocide all over the world. Not even, and everybody, Joe did a great job of mentioning all the wars. I was going to do that too. Okay, but I really do believe that we need to be very clear. We need to show solidarity with all the struggles within this country against racism, against militarism, against the prison industrial complex, for jobs, and we need to tie that in with the demand that US, NATO, no US, NATO aggression in Ukraine, no war, no sanctions, fund human needs. That's what we need, not war.
Thank you, Judy. Our last speaker on the panel is Jeff Macker. Jeff is the one person I don't have his written bio for. And he's someone I've known for many, many decades. So I'll try to wing it and he'll correct me. But he's a member of the UNAC Administrative Committee, and he organizes UNAC in the West Coast. He is a retired teacher and organizer of the Teachers Union in Hayward, California. And he is a leader of Socialist Action. Jeff, you can add or correct or whatever, but you're up now.
Joe, you didn't say that I'm a very handsome fellow, thanks.
That was on purpose, Jeff.
Okay. UNAC is a coalition of many different groups with different opinions on the governments of different countries in the world, but we are focused on US imperialism, not by accident. The United States government has 1,100 military bases in 110 countries around the world. China, our leading economic opponent, has one in Djibouti, Africa, and Russia has one outside its borders and 6 in the former Soviet republics. The United States spends more on the military than the entire world combined. Let's talk about 2014, where there was a coup. This was a classic US orchestrated coup. It began with fascist snipers from buildings overhead, firing on a peaceful crowd in the center, Maidan Square, of Ukraine. And the media of the world jumped on it and said it was the Yanukovych government. The fascist crowd armed itself and took over the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada. They banned the majority parties from participating and established a rump government whose first act was to negate the treaties that Ukraine had signed with Russia for bailout. in preference to the high interest rate loans that the EU offered. They banned the Russian language. They recognized and armed the fascist battalions and integrated the Azov battalion and integrated them into the Ukrainian army and ordered them to march on the Donbass. They ordered the soldiers of Eastern Europe to fight against the Russian-speaking population, and the entire Ukrainian army, bar none, deserted and joined the Russian army. All of this was revealed not by just my words, but by the US representative to the EU, Victoria Nuland. She picked the coup prime minister of the country. She was in communication with Vice President Biden, who oversaw the affair. United States established a minister of economics in Ukraine. Joe Biden's son was given a job on the biggest oil corporation at $50,000 a month. Well, the Ukrainian people and the Russian-speaking people in the East resisted. And for 10 years, 8 years since 2014, they have been shelling the Russian-speaking people, led by fascist troops who bombed the cities and the buildings, killing 14,000 Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the Donbass. We're not indifferent to the US coups. We know that they take place around
1 minute.
The United States organized 20 years of hiring killed 1 million people in Afghanistan. They orchestrated an intervention with NATO and the Gulf state monarchies against Syria that killed 500,000 people. They orchestrated and financed the Iran-Iraq war that killed 2 million people in the Middle East. They murdered 1.5 million people in the Iraq war. They supported the fascist coup in Egypt, and they support sanctions and murderous coup efforts all over the world, including an attempt to remove the Venezuelan government. We say US out now, hands off, no to the fascist coup makers, self-determination to the oppressed people of the Donbass region. US NATO out now, abolish US NATO, stop the war machine, billions for human needs, for healthcare, for education, for the poor, not imperialist war and intervention. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. The way we planned the format today, before we got into questions, we were going to just see if, based upon what people said, any of the panelists had, in a very short period of time, anything to say. So let me just go down the list again and see if anybody wants to say something at this point before we go into questions and discussion. Patricia, would you like to make another comment at this point?
Yes, and I appreciate all the discussion and the information that's being given out right now, because right now what's happening is the media is fomenting a hysteria. And there's a very racist approach that's being taken to demonizing all of the foreign leaders and countries that are targeted by the US and its allies, where the demonized leader becomes essentially undifferentiated from the people as a whole. Russia is 145 million people. And demonizing an entire people, that makes it possible and justified in the eyes of so many people to do whatever. That dehumanization and that racist dehumanization, that's very important to the war machine. I want to also call attention to two pieces, one of which the GDP of Russia is less than that of Texas, for one. And secondly, Russia's military spending is around $62 billion a year. The US spends $1 trillion every year on war, on death and destruction. And so as we are here in the US, for many of us here in the US, when we look at what is the greatest threat to the world right now, it's the US military, it's the US empire that's continually expanding, overthrowing governments, that's polluting the world. Russia and China need to be our allies in the fight against climate change. In the fight to end poverty and end homelessness, to build on a on peace and cooperation, on a foundation of peace and cooperation. We can do that. We can do that. We need a new system. We need to fight. We need to organize and really build for a better society.
Jacqueline, would you like to make a comment before going to questions and discussion?
Yes, thank you. And I will actually have to hop off when I'm done with my comments. I appreciate the ability to just kind of get personal with the space, because this reminds me that this fight is personal, and it needs to be far more personal than people make it, because I don't think we can ever forget that for 6 years, Black voters mostly were smeared and targeted and tarred with the mantle, the albatross of being Russian bots, because so many of us refused to vote for Hillary Clinton, because so many of us understood that the Democratic Party could not and should not be saved by us. And we were treated, those of us who did vote, we were treated as if we were so stupid and unsophisticated that we could be swayed by some social media ads allegedly put in motion by Vladimir Putin himself to keep people from voting for Hillary Clinton, or to force people to vote for Donald Trump, or to force people not to vote at all. So there has been this racist narrative directed toward Black people in this country and other working class, poor, and oppressed people of color, that we had to vote for the Democratic Party, or else we were tools of Putin. And then when Hillary Clinton lost an election she never should have lost to the circus clown Donald Trump, then everything Trump did was supposedly in collusion with Vladimir Putin, and then Black voters were blamed for that. Look at what you allowed to be done by not voting for Hillary Clinton, by questioning the Democratic Party, by not going along with vote blue no matter who, and eliminating or avoiding this man getting into office. So here we are 6 years later, after this incessant drumbeat of Russiagate and blaming Black voters for not voting for Hillary Clinton. It is not a surprise that at the end of that 2 to 6 years, at the end of that very sophisticated PR campaign using and against Black voters, that now there is a mass ignoring of literal neo-Nazis in Ukraine. There is an ignoring of people who look like me, who are trying to, and who look like Patricia, and who look like so many of our Asian and Brazilian and Colombian friends who are trying to leave Ukraine but are being brutalized by those forces. So I think that when we're having this discussion about what needs to be done about Ukraine, yes, we absolutely say no to NATO, and we must disband, end the US, EU, NATO axis of domination, but we should also not let the Democratic Party off the hook for what they did by using Black voters to set this narrative in motion in 2016. So thank you so much, everyone, for participating, and peace if you're willing to fight for it, because we have to.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Take care. Next, see if Rick has a comment he'd like to make.
Yeah, just one comment, which is there are not only lies of commission, there are lies of omission. And I saw a short video earlier today that was appeared on RT, and they show in depth an abandoned Ukrainian military base that they, with thousands of soldiers, hundreds of tons of weapons, and actual identities all over the place. They obviously abandoned this place in great haste. It's an amazing little video, and I can pretty much guarantee, or I think I can guarantee, that it's not going to be shown on any of the major channels. So I recommend to people to look at it, to learn a little bit more about what's going on that most people are not hearing about.
Thank you, Rick. Rhonda?
Yeah, just wanted to add around NATO, last year or 2 years ago, they released their NATO 2030 supposedly new strategy. But one of the things that was in it that was kind of new was the identification of China as a new, one of its principal threats. It always talked about Russia, and now they have the addition of China in there very squarely and very clear. And so, what I think is happening with that is like we're going to have this dangerous expansion of NATO, not only where it's been all these years and into other adjacent parts, but now further and further into the Asia Pacific region. And so if anybody thought that NATO was just going to go quietly away after the Cold War was over, think again, because it's just trying to expand. It's moving into new territory. It's going to be recruiting new states, member states, and then it's also asking more of its members in terms of military spending as a percentage of budget. And as we all talked about here today, who's going to be profiting from that? The big U.S. weapons corporations. So, it's really imperative that we take up the campaign and the call to dismantle NATO. NATO, shouldn't even exist. And, that has to be one of the front and center calls of the movement today if we actually want peace in Ukraine or anywhere else in the world.
Thank you. Judy?
Sure. If people don't mind my comments being a little bit all over the place, let me just, I don't think it really has been mentioned, but in passing it was that really US NATO not only wants to destroy Russia, but they want to make their way to China. And the US in particular is very threatened by China and the role it has been playing in the world. And I think that the vote in the UN, which the United States thought they could just whip up everybody against Russia, was really very telling in the fact that 1/2 of the African nations either vetoed the resolution or abstained, because Russia and China both have built a lot of support, have been supporting the nations of Africa and a lot of places around the world that all the US supports is with drones and military bases, as opposed to infrastructure and things like that. The only other thing that I want to mention, and it's just to me so telling of how, I really do believe that what's happening is a cementing of a greater alliance between the Democrats and the Republicans in the war effort. And recently, Biden, who was never a friend of the Black Lives Matter movement, he said it, I think, in a State of the Union address. He said, make it clear, I'm not for defunding the police. I'm not going to take one penny from the police. In fact, I am for increasing their funding. And I think that this, to me, besides it being a total insult to anti-racist forces and Black and brown youth and the Black Lives Matter movement, it's just very telling in terms of that there is really an even greater militarization that's going to be unfolding, not only abroad with US and NATO and threats on Ukraine, but also at home against the most oppressed communities. And we have to be ready to try to tie them together and to try to build a very strong fight back movement.
All right, Jeff, you're next. You're the last speaker, and then we're going to questions.
Thanks, Joe. Since the Biden election, the Congress has been paralyzed. They haven't been able to pass any legislation other than that benefits the corporate rich. Along comes an imperialist war, and you see a bipartisan Democratic-Republican Party crescendo. You see additional billions being sent to the Ukraine. You see the United States demanding that everybody in NATO arm the Ukraine, which is a government which is put in power by a US-backed fascist coup. What's this really about from the vantage point of the United States? They didn't urge the Ukrainian army to march on the east for nothing. They wanted to take over the pipelines that deliver the majority of gas and fuel to Europe, which is now provided by Russian pipelines and has been the case for decades. This is the United States version of an oil war, just like the Venezuelan blockade, which was one of the world's largest oil reserve countries. The same thing with Iran and Iraq. It was an oil war. When the United States conquered Iraq, they turned over Iraq's oil contracts to US corporations. They want to do the same, and they want to charge the Europeans 2 to 3 times more than the cheap fracked Russian gas. So this has to do with who's going to control, in resource-wise, one of the richest countries in Europe. Who's going to exploit their wheat, their barley, their second and third in the world in that? Who's going to control their oil, their mineral rights, and so on. One little tiny point. The New York Times the day before yesterday, buried in the editorial page, had a reporter saying one thing, one line. She said, 75% of what we're reading in the media is lies. That's unusual for the New York Times that has been blaring 6-column headlines every day, blaming the Russians for everything in the world. This lone reporter, 75% of what's on the media is lies. This is the propaganda machine of the United States. They talk about a free press. The free press in the United States is totally controlled by the corporations. The people have no voice in the press. It's a multi-billion-dollar media conglomerate that they use to determine public opinions. Glad to be on the panel. Let's see what participants have to say.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm surprised that 25% is correct. If only 75% is wrong. As far as I'm concerned, in the media in the United States, if it's not a fire or a shooting, everything else is slanted. But anyway, here's a big question, and this is the real question. In some sense, we're all feeling isolated right now because of this incredible propaganda and this rush to condemn Russia, but not even look at what the United States is doing. So someone wrote that in 2003, millions of us turned out in the streets to protest the Iraq war, but it did not end. So what do we need to do now to end this war? Now, this is really a strategic question, and I'll put my 2 cents in if others want to try and first answer that question. Anybody want to do that? You can just raise your hand so I can see it, or you can raise your hand on the panel and I will call on you, either way. Okay, let me get someone else, Jeff, because you just spoke. Let me start with Patricia.
I just wanted to say we should have some more questions from the audience and then have some speakers answer.
Okay, would you rather do that?
Yeah.
Okay, well, a lot of these questions, if you take them, they can be put together in some ways. Another question, which I think is a similar question, said 900,000 people are dead from COVID, but we couldn't get any unanimity in this country on what to do about that. But it seems that there's a lot of unanimity around this war. And someone else asked, and this is from someone who I know is a very strong anti-imperialist, and I guess it's like a rhetorical question in some sense. He asks, is Russia out of Ukraine now a slogan that can bring us unity? Another question is the US conducting a proxy war in Ukraine in a similar way that it conducted a proxy war in Syria? So let me start with those, and then people can answer those. Keep it short. If someone else gives an answer that you are going to give, you don't need to do it. And this way we can get to talking to more, get questions from more people. Who would like to go first on these? Patricia, would you still want to go first? You had your hand up.
Sure. There are a number of different points that were raised, but when we look at the parallels to the Iraq War, and when we look at what happened of millions of people came out into the street all over the world in protest against this completely unprovoked invasion of a country that the U.S. had decimated for the 10 years prior through economic warfare, killing 500,000 children and actually killing 1 million Iraqis even before the 2000 invasion that killed yet another million and displaced millions more, and created this vacuum through which these right-wing fundamentalist reactionary groups could flourish. So we see the plan that the U.S. has for Ukraine, as Hillary Clinton had come out and said of, we want to bring on the Afghanistan model. And so the question is of, well, the war continued in Iraq. That's because fundamentally the issue that we're facing in society is that the Pentagon, the US government and the Pentagon, who do they serve? They serve the richest in the society. They serve the complete oligarchs, the top oligarchs. Russian oligarchs are somewhere between like number 134 to 140. But number one, number two, all the way, top 100 is US, dominated by the US for US capital, for US expansion. And as long as we have this economic system that's premised on these billionaires, these oligarchs at the top that own and control and dominate all of this, we will continue to see this, because war is not a policy choice of they're breaking open new markets. They need to have all these countries that are subject to the whims of US foreign policy. And so what will bring peace? How do we stop? How do we put an end to this? We need to build a movement. Right now, again, this mass hysteria is going on. We need to patiently explain. We need to win people over. We need to lay out the history. We need to learn how to be persuasive, to learn the facts and push out what U.S. imperialism is forcing out from all these different angles. So we need to be able to reach people with our message and pulling away from war. I mean, that's really the critical task right now, because I want to say too, if you really care about Ukrainians, and I know all of us here do, and so many people, I want to say as well, of so many people who they see what they are being shown and they genuinely feel pain and anguish. And if they were shown what is happening in Palestine, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, people have a connection with other people. We know that we're connected with working people. And when we talk with people, we can't back down. Even if our position, even if this is not a popular position, this is what it means of having political principles. We need to be firm in saying, to tell people, if you really care about the Ukrainian people, if you really care about working people, if you really care about Eastern Europe and about stopping this war, then we would pull out all U.S. weapons from the area, immediately begin diplomatic resolution, because there's no military resolution here. This is devastating the country of Ukraine. This is destabilizing Eastern Europe, and this is making the Pentagon, big oil, and all these other weapons manufacturers very happy as their stock prices are going up, and we're seeing these calls for drilling, for fracking, and for cracking down on any opposition. So we have to stand firm, and we have to win people over.
Okay, thank you. Further discussion? Okay, I see Judy. Anybody else after Judy? All right, then I'll make a comment after Judy and then Jeff. Go on, Judy.
Are you sure you don't want to go first? You haven't talked for a while. I'm happy to wait until you talk, and then I will. It's up to you.
Well, okay, I'll just say what I'm going to say. There's a woman in the question thing who said she went to the New York demonstration yesterday around our demands and couldn't find it. There were 150 people there, but she couldn't find it because there were a lot of right-wing Ukrainians there, and she was lost in that milieu. There's a lot of right-wing Ukrainians in the United States. Pretty soon I'm going to send something out to our UNAC discussion lists and others about some work that has been done to show who some of these people are. There are camps of Ukrainians in the United States where they do military training, where they have statues of Bandera and other Nazis. That exists in the United States. And in many ways, it's being supported by our government. But the real question that was asked here was, how do we build a movement that's going to be effective to change things? And, I lived through the Vietnam movement, and it started out as a minority movement. Only 8% was against the war. By the end of the war, 88% was against the war. And I saw the power of that movement, masses of people on the streets. It affected every level of society. There was a youth rebellion. There was countercultural movement. It was in our music. It was in the way we dressed. It got into the military. The military refused to fight. That's a way to stop it. By depending upon our legislatures that are united around this war, it will never work. The question then is, how do we get to that point? And one of the reasons I believe that the isolation we're feeling right now is going to end soon, because truth will come through. People will understand what's happening. We need to speak it as loud as we can and as often as we can, and we will see that will happen. But there's another point, and it's unity. And especially when there are sections of the anti-war movement that are giving into the propaganda and giving into the pressure, we need unity among those that are not. UNAC, I think, tries to bring that unity into different groups. I believe the Answer Coalition does too. I would love to see the Answer Coalition and UNAC be meeting on a regular basis, figuring out strategy on how we can work together, building demonstrations together, making sure that they are as big as possible. Because one other thing I found out in the anti-war movement is if you have two organizations and one can bring out 100 people and the other organization can bring out 100 people, when they work together, you bring out 1,000 people. Unity is essential as we work towards building a mass movement that can not only end the war, but end the causes of war, which is this capitalist system. And we really need to think about how to do that. It's not a simple answer. I can't say if you do this step and this step and this step and this step, you will get there. But we move in the direction of unity and a mass movement, and we will get there invariably. That's my thoughts. Judy, you're up.
Okay, and definitely you can certainly add the International Action Center as an organization that would
which is a member of UNAC and
which is a member of UNAC, but we also stand on our own. We actually had a very successful webinar just a couple of nights ago on the same topic. But I wanted to address just very briefly about why should we not call and not say Russian troops out of the Ukraine. And I think it's really important that the movement that we are trying to rebuild does not use the same formulation that the corporate media is using right now, because all that does is it confuses people. Because if we say that the problem of the Ukraine is US NATO intervention and aggression, and there was obviously, Russia was pushed to respond. It didn't really have a choice. So I think we have to be very clear that, and we have to explain to people. It's sort of like we were out there in downtown Berkeley just Friday night talking to people who everyone had the hype. Everyone believed the hype. Everyone drank the Kool-Aid. And we spent a lot of time talking to people, and you can begin, and it's going to take I don't know, I hope it happens soon, but I feel like I went through this not long ago with the Vietnam War. And also, honestly, with the Iraq War and the Afghani War, people were not necessarily totally against it at first. But we need to figure out a way, in whatever way we can, whether it be union resolutions, whether it be community protests. And I think people do want to go out and protest in the streets, and where we can do that, we should do it. At the same time, realizing that we might be attacked by right-wing Ukrainians. But I think it's a many-faceted approach. We have to keep our focus on the US and NATO. And the neutrality the history of neutrality of the Ukraine and not fall for the hype and not take Russian troops out as our slogan.
Thank you. Jeff, anybody else after Jeff would like to answer any of these questions? Jeff, and then we'll move on.
Well, with any protest movement against the policies of the bipartisan policies of the government of the United States, one ingredient we need is courage to tell the truth. If we say Russia out now, that's basically a slogan that is akin to what the right wing said during the Vietnam War, better red than dead. The United States said that if we leave Vietnam, all Southeast Asia will go communist. So they started bombing all Southeast Asia. We won the hearts and minds of the American people. We were helped by Dr. King and Malcolm X, who linked the war, a racist war against oppressed people in the United States, to the imperialist war abroad. That brought new forces into our midst. But adopting the central slogan of US imperialism makes it basically impossible to build any serious movement, even if you say everybody out of Ukraine. We have to recognize the cold truth. The United States is an imperialist beast. It invents pretexts every day. They killed 1.5 million Iraqis because Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. They planned a coup in Venezuela, and they literally had right-wingers fire on US food deliveries to help the starving people of Venezuela, as if the Venezuelan people shot the food, the delivery into their country. That was a pretext. They said that Gaddafi was going to kill 50,000 people in Benghazi. That was a pretext. They said that Vietnam and the Tonkin Bay attacked a US destroyer. That was a pretext. Every single one of these issues, they said that the Syrians attacked a peaceful demonstration in Damascus. That was a US fabrication. So we have to learn to tell the truth. And part of that is to understand the nature of the beast. When I said that the United States has 1,100 military bases in 110 countries, sanctions, which is war against 40 countries, has 53 military bases in Africa, that should tell you something. That's more than the entire world combined. China, who is pilloried in the US press, despite whatever disagreements and characterizations I have on China, and I do, China has one base in the world, and the Russians have 6, and 1 in Syria, at the invitation of the Syrian government, I might add. And my view is any oppressed nation and people has a right to ask for aid against the US-backed imperialist intervention. So when the Venezuelans asked for Russian food aid and health aid, I didn't oppose that. When the Syrians asked for aid after the US forces occupied 3/4 of Syria and were on the outskirts of Damascus to impose a US dictatorship, I had no objection for the Syrians asking help from Iran or any other country. I feel the same way about Ukraine. I have many questions about the intentions of the Russian government. I don't support that government, but I don't put it on the same level as US imperialism in Ukraine or in most other countries in the world. It's the United States imperialist beast that under Obama conducts 7 simultaneously wars that slaughtered
3 minutes.
innocent people. So we have to be patient and strong, build a united movement, bide our time, and always tell the truth. And somewhere along the line, someone said the truth shall make you free. The truth is on our side, and we have to make it happen, link up with working people everywhere, and fight US imperialist wars.
Okay, let me ask another question, and then we can see where to go from there. This is a little bit longer of one. Isn't calling the Russian action an intervention rather than, isn't calling the Russian action an invasion rather than an intervention, denying and ignoring the right of the people of Donbass to request help? Self-determination is denied to them even when they had no other way of fighting the arms and training of the US proxies, proxy military led by Nazis. And if the motives of the Russian Federation were also to stop another NATO member state on their border, why should we be against that in combination with answering the call from Donetsk and Lugansk? Was that clear or not?
Absolutely.
In other words,
Well
the
said.
idea, what?
I said absolutely clear and well said.
Are there any other questions? I mean, I feel like we've been sort of somewhat talking about that, but are there other questions that maybe could take us in a slightly different direction? And people can respond to that one too. You see, there's about 30 questions.
Yeah, it was, but a lot of them are not the stuff that a question comes out easily for. Does anybody have information sources for some of the places where you can get more and better information than people are getting? Is it possible that NATO's strategy is to let the Ukrainian military wear down the Russian military in order to weaken it, and then NATO to invade Russia from some other country bordering Russia? Can the current peace negotiations that are going on the border with Belarus be effective?
Joe, did you see that Rick has to leave in about 5 minutes?
Okay, Rick, did you have an answer
Why
to
don't we
any of
let
this?
Rick sum up or answer questions or do whatever he would like to?
That sounds fine. Would you like to do that, Rick?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Joe. In terms of information sources, there's a very good analyst in Europe called Moon of Alabama, moonofalabama.org. It's a curious name, but there's a lot of traffic. There's a lot of good information that's posted there. The other day, he was referring to the analysis of a Canadian who was in the Canadian military and did a lot of work studying the Soviet Union, and he was in Moscow. His name is Patrick Armstrong. PatrickArmstrong.ca is a very interesting analyst. Of course, RT, referring to the video that I mentioned earlier, there's a tremendous amount of good information on RT with good videos. We know that RT is being shut down in a lot of places. It's not just they're feeding us propaganda, they're trying to prevent us, the public, from knowing good information. Another good source of information is southfront.org. They have a lot of amazing videos there. I saw a video the other day of some Ukrainians in the east who were trying to escape. They were captured by the Azov battalion, and one person was killed in the ensuing exchange. So there's a lot of good information at southfront.org. I think I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. So anybody else, let's do answering of any of the questions and your final statements now. Who else would like to go next? And Pippa, if you have something to say, please raise your hand and say it. Pippa and I were together in Ukraine in 2019. All right, Pippa has her hand up. Pippa, you're on.
Thank you very much. for giving me the chance to say a few words. I'll be very quick. Can somebody time me, please? Really what I want to say is remember the root cause of this. Remember the real enemy, which is not Russia or Ukraine. It's the billionaires who bought your governments. It's the banks who finance the machines, the corporate media who spin the lies. And hold the line. We've got to hold the line. Everyone who's in this under a barrage of propaganda, trying to change our minds, trying to confuse our focus. But the most important thing we can do now is hold the line. Thank you. And sorry for cutting people off if I did.
Thank you, Pippa. Who would like to go next to answer any of the last questions? I see Patricia's hand up.
Well, I wanted to say this is going to be an ongoing process where we need to learn, where we need to look at different sources. WikiLeaks, this was a few years back, had published one of the documents from the U.S. I highly recommend people go and look this up, of the Army Special Forces unconventional warfare document from 2008. Certainly a lot has changed since that time, but they laid the basis for what they call psychological warfare. And of showing different wrong information, different kinds of information to build up a hysteria. The Ghost of Kiev that we saw, which turned out to be a actual video game that was shown and displayed. And taking also, and I even had a family member had reposted this video that someone had taken of Ahed Tamimi, the young Palestinian child standing up to an Israeli soldier, and with the caption of Ukrainian children rise. And of course it's an amazing video, but it was attributed, it was not attributed to who it actually was, to brutal Israeli occupation. So we need to explain, we need to pull back from this hysteria. I'm part of the Answer Coalition, which stands for Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. And Answer was formed in the days after 9/11, when it became clear that the US government was going to use its racist demonization to go after Iraq, to go after Afghanistan. What we are in now is the period of hysteria, of racist demonization of Russian people, an attempt to dehumanize an entire population, erase an entire population, while the wars on Yemen are continuing, while the occupation of Palestine is continuing, while the US is bombing Somalia and expanding its military bases around the globe. Our enemies are not poor people in Yemen. Our enemies are not people in Palestine. Our enemies are not Russian people. Our enemies are the people that laid us off from our jobs, that deny us healthcare, that make it impossible to get an education. Our enemies are not in the poorest countries on the planet. They're right here in the richest one. So we need to come together. We need to fight. We need to stand firm and win people over, and pull back from this war, stop this war, and fight for a new society.
Thank you. Who would like to go next? Should I just pick? Okay, here's Judy and Jeff, two people who are good at going next.
No, let's do Rhonda. Let's do Rhonda.
Rhonda, you're next.
Oh, no, I think you should go first and then I'll go after.
All right. Well, all right. I don't want to take up that much airspace. But I do want to say that I think that, I very much agree with what Patricia and some of the other speakers just said, and I don't want to reiterate it. But I think that we have to be very clear that things are going to get harder, as they did in the struggle around the Vietnam War, and that we have to. It's really up to us to be as clear as possible and not capitulate. The pressure is going to be incredible for us to. To begin talking about a Russian invasion, to say Russian troops out now, to talk about some of the things that U.S. imperialism is doing a little violin number on right now. And I think, talking about the Palestinians, it made me, some of the statements that I've read out of Palestine, they said, it is really clear to us, we are not, we know what role the U.S. has played vis-a-vis Palestine. We know what role, we also know the role of fascists in the Ukraine. And so they were very clear that there is absolutely no way that they would support the situation that's going on right now, and not believing the hype. And I think not only do we have to, we are under a lot of pressure. We don't have the strength, honestly, of the movements that a large part of the world does. And at the same time, I think we have to look and see, internationally, there's a lot of support for our anti-imperialist position here in the United States. And the problem is we have to build up the support internally and figure out a way that we can win people over. And I do believe that, there is a link between the wars abroad and the wars of US NATO abroad, and they're countless, and the wars at home against the Black, brown, and indigenous populations. And we have to continue to tie that together. And we also at the same time have to continue to, and just one more thing, I'll just end with, we did not hold, well, that's another thing. But there was recently a demonstration in San Francisco demanding, freedom for Haiti, demanding US NATO out of Haiti. And I think we got the best response because the Haitian community and the Haitian activists understand, they see the role that US and NATO played in NATO and continue to play in Haiti in terms of firming up dictators, sending in troops and killing people in the streets is the same role that US NATO is playing right now in Eastern Europe and in the Ukraine. So the links that we can make to the struggles that are going on will certainly help break through the lies and break through the big business corporate media propaganda. That's it.
Jeff, and then I'll go and mention a couple of housekeeping things. Go on, Jeff.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, Rhonda, did I skip over you?
Yeah, so I'll go after Jeff because my hand came up after Jeff's, and then you can have the closing words, Joe.
Okay.
Okay. We should not forget that the Vietnam War was some 60 years ago, before most of our listeners were born. I was a young man at the time, and it was the middle of the McCarthy era. Anyone who opposed US foreign policy was blacklisted, pilloried. In fact, there had never been an anti-war movement during a war in the history of the United States. So we pioneered new ground. It took us a while. Today, the situation is much different. I think that we can see a turnaround in the immediate future. 25 million people, majority Black, mobilized for Black Lives Matter, and they brought a truth forward that nobody had ever admitted. The United States has a systemic racism embedded in its very being. It slaughtered millions of Native American people. The most advanced capitalist country in the world, the United States, has the largest number and percentage of its people in prison, in the racist for-profit prison industrial complex. The most advanced nation on earth has over 920,000 people dead from COVID, the largest number in the world and among the highest percentages. The real unemployment rate, contrary to what CNN reports as 2.8, is closer to 25% if you calculate the people who have stopped looking for work. The rich and the poor difference is greater than any time in American history, with the 1% controlling the vast majority of the wealth of the American people. The United States wants to blame this on the Russians or on the Chinese or whatever. But increasing numbers of people understand there's something fundamentally wrong with the way this for-profit system works. They understand that war is profitable, that the stock market and the military-industrial complex benefits by every missile fired because they replace it with another, with more tanks and weapons of mass destruction. War is ingrained in the system itself. So the beginning of knowledge is to build an independent movement based on mobilization and mass action and unity. We can do that. And the time is going to come when every speaker who takes the podium at an anti-war rally is going to link the oppression of working people at home with the oppression of US imperialism around the world. I'm patient, I'm confident in working people's ability to unite and fight for their own class interest, to rebuild the trade union movement, to unify with the movements of the oppressed, and to build a strong socialist movement at the same time. That's why I'm in Socialist Action. That's why I'm in UNAC. That's why I really enjoy working with all honest anti-war fighters and activists.
Okay, there were some questions about the chat, and apparently the selection for people to copy the chat was not on. I'll try to make that be on next time. But what I will do is everybody who registered will get an email tomorrow, 24 hours after the webinar. I will put a link to the chat in there. I will also put a link to the video of this webinar. So if you'd like to refer back to what anybody else said, you will be able to see it there. You should get both of those when you get the email from Zoom. If you just read down towards the bottom where you can put something in and you could look at that. I just want to say that on the day.
Joe, Rhonda.
Yes, I'm sorry. Did I not have Rhonda?
No,
I'm
Rhonda
sorry.
has not gone yet.
Rhonda, I'm sorry. You
It's okay,
go,
Joe.
and then I will finish.
Okay, you conclude. I just wanted to say that we have to do as much as we can. I know it's hard in the United States to do this, but to be able to explain NATO to the average person and why we need to oppose it. I think this has been one of the hardest tasks as someone of my generation, trying to explain, why we need to oppose this US NATO aggression, but it can be done, and I think as we've talked about here, the linking to concrete issues that people are facing in their everyday lives, like Judy was saying, school closures in Oakland, like Patricia was saying, people being laid off, like others have said, people losing housing and shelter. We can tie it to NATO, militarism, the military spending of this country, and that whole agenda. But we need to make it that concrete. It's not enough to just say, no NATO, no US NATO hands off. We really have to connect it to those issues. And I think, that's one of the things that was also happening when we had the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War era, was that connection to issues that people could feel in their daily lives. And, it's something that has to be done now. One of the projects that BAYAN is working on is a campaign against NATO. Like, how do you break it down to young Filipinos in the United States, who, for them, right, NATO is very far away. It's in Europe. Our homeland is in the Asia Pacific. But once we start talking about how it's trying to expand and the connection between the militarist, agenda of the United States and its allies in Europe to maintaining the same system that oppresses us in the Philippines or here in the United States, people start to get it and it clicks. And those are the kind of connections that we need to make to be able to demystify what is NATO to folks. Talk about what its responsibility is in this conflict and help to build up the the movement against both war and for something else, the priority of people's needs, over the profit of the war machine. So I wanted to just end on that for today and, hope to as I don't know if it was Judy or someone else who said, this is a long struggle we have ahead. We're going to have to make different choices about calls to action and everything going forward. But I think we do have a lot of unity on the primacy of the US and NATO in advancing imperialism and war today. So thanks everybody for being here. And I'll turn it over to you now, Joe, for the last words.
Okay. Sorry about that. Well, I did mention the housekeeping things. Let me just end with this. On the day that the Russians entered Ukraine, the day before they were asked to do it because the bombing and shelling in the Lugansk and Donetsk areas had increased to a fever pitch. It was very difficult. People were evacuating. The Russians sent buses to get people over the Russian line. We didn't hear those voices. But on that very day, we heard lots of stuff on all the media, but here are some things we didn't hear. That on that day, the United States dropped bombs in Somalia. We didn't hear about that. On that day, Israel dropped bombs in Damascus. We didn't hear about that. On that day, Saudi Arabia did 37 bombing raids of Yemen, and we didn't hear about that. These people are not moved by ethics, are not moved by the misery of people that is caused by their wars. They are moved by politics. And we must always be aware of that. And that must be what also moves us. And the other thing that was not said in this meeting is, up until a couple of weeks ago, when we used the words existential threat, a threat to the very beings of people on this planet, we used it in the context of climate change. And it is that threat. But now we got to use it also in the context of war, because there are nuclear powers that can cause the destruction of this entire world. And it all could have been stopped by the United States saying, we will not move NATO into Ukraine. And they refused to do it. If you read Telesur today, you'll see some memos that came out about the possibility of nuclear weapons being used in this crisis. Telesur is the news agency that comes out of Venezuela. And you will also hear probably in the coming days something that I heard, that the Russians now have captured from some of the Ukrainian army folks a playbook, which was to go further than Donbass and to go into Russia. And the US is not going to say that, but some of that will come out through our movement. And we must understand that as a possibility. When the entire Cold War started, it started at the end of World War II, because every previous war, at the end of the war, the military was demobilized and people went home. But at the end of World War II, after the US dropped 2 nuclear weapons, bombs, when no other power had nuclear bombs as a deterrent, they did not demobilize the military. And in the military, there became an anti-war movement. It was called Bring the Troops Home movement, where they held demonstrations to be brought home. The US didn't want to do that, and there was serious discussion of moving the military into Russia to end that revolution that had been going on there. The US still has the same playbook. They want to get rid of Russia because whatever characterization you make of Russia, it is not under the control of Washington and Wall Street. It's making alliances with Russia, which is with China, which is challenging the whole hegemonic power that the United States has. And so we are in for conflict. We are in for conflict with nuclear powers. During the rise of this conflict in Ukraine, the United States sent a warship through the strait between Taiwan and China. That was a provocative move. So we need an anti-war movement. We need to start by saying no to NATO. We need to explain to everybody we can. We need unity. And I think if we stick together and we keep on telling the truth and we keep on fighting for what we believe in, I think we're going to get there, and we're the best possibility of trying to stay the hand of the United States. We, the anti-war movement in the United States. So thanks everybody for coming tonight. There'll be more organization and education activities to do. UNAC will let you know about them. Other groups will let you know about them. Let's fight alongside BAYAN in their campaign against NATO, and let's fight together. Thank you all. Good night.